In a luxurious mansion in Boston, a billionaire discovers that items from his storage room have gone missing 5 times in just 28 days. Suspicion quickly falls on his elderly black housekeeper, the woman who has cared for him for decades since the day his parents died. The following night he secretly follows her after work to uncover the truth. But what he finds doesn't expose a thief, it reveals a truth that will shatter his assumptions and change everything he thought he knew. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Harrison Caldwell was not a man who missed details. At 34, he ran Caldwell Innovations, a technology firm specializing in smart urban housing solutions, with the kind of precision normally reserved for Swiss watchmaking. People described him as brilliant, decisive, emotionally unavailable but efficient to the core. He dressed in dark suits with barely a crease, spoke in clipped tones that left no room for guessing, and moved through life as if every second not accounted for was a failure in management. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't warm, he simply functioned on a level where empathy was impractical. That morning, Harrison delivered the keynote at the Boston Tech Innovation Summit. The applause echoed cleanly across the auditorium as he stepped away from the podium, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light just right. His speech, structured around algorithms and predictive analytics for affordable housing, was praised as sharp, forward-thinking, and brilliantly data-driven. He nodded through the compliments, posed for the requested photos, then slipped out exactly 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The drive home to Beacon Hill was silent. He didn't like music in the car. It distracted him. Instead, he reviewed a dashboard of live company metrics on his tablet. Project overruns, hiring delays, investment risk scores, everything was within thresholds, as it should be. His townhouse recognized his vehicle on approach. Gates opened automatically, lights inside adjusted, the front entrance clicked open before he reached the last step. Josephine Turner was standing just inside, as she always did. No words, just a nod, and a slight adjustment of the folded cloth in her hand. "Welcome home, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "Anything urgent?" "No. My messages are on my desk." "Dinner at 8, he nodded, already halfway up the stairs. Joe didn't follow. She returned to the kitchen, disappearing into routine. Joe had worked in the Caldwell household since Harrison was 5 years old. After the accident that took his parents, a commercial plane crash that made national headlines for 3 weeks, she had been the one to sit by his bed at night, the one to pack his school lunches, the one who remembered which foods made him sick and which books soothed him back to sleep. She had never asked for recognition. She had never expected it. Over the years her presence had become part of the house, like the polished floors or the steady hum of the climate control system. Later that evening, while checking the latest performance reports from a development partner in Chicago, Harrison noticed a system flag in the home management interface. It was minor, 5 instances over 28 days of unaccounted for items from the food inventory and medical supply cabinet. Quantities were small, a few cans of soup, boxes of pasta, bottles of Gatorade, children's Tylenol, Band-Aids, all flagged by the automated reconciliation log as missing with no associated event. He stared at the notification. It wasn't enough to sound an alarm, but it was inconsistent. And Harrison did not tolerate inconsistency. Not in his business, not in his home. He accessed the internal access logs. Only 4 individuals had nighttime clearance to storage: himself, his executive assistant who was currently traveling, the estate's head chef who hadn't worked nights in over a month, and Joe. Her name appeared on 5 dates, each time roughly between 10 and 10:45. Each time aligned precisely with the anomalies. He didn't react. Not outwardly. He simply sat back, stared at the screen a little longer, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger, not suspicion, something stranger, something colder. The kind of feeling you get when someone you thought you understood suddenly doesn't match the picture anymore. It wasn't the food or the supplies, it was the silence, the unspoken act. Joe had access, she knew the system, she could have asked, but she didn't. He turned off the monitor, closed the tablet, and looked toward the hallway. The house was quiet, impeccable. Joe was somewhere in it, folding linens or adjusting the automated lighting schedule, doing what she had always done, supporting his life without ever stepping into its center. And for the first time in years, Harrison realized he had no idea what Josephine Turner did after she left the estate. No idea where she went, who she spoke to, whether she had family or friends, what she ate for dinner when she wasn't cooking his. He knew her habits down to precision. But beyond them, there was only silence. And now, for reasons he couldn't explain yet, that felt like a problem. Harrison didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't tossing or pacing or replaying the data in his head. It was the kind of restlessness that lived just under the skin, a tightness, a mild pulse in the chest that refused to be reasoned with. The kind of discomfort that didn't interrupt your logic but quietly challenged it. By morning, the feeling hadn't passed. By the following evening, it had grown into a decision. He told his assistant to clear his last meeting. No details, just a reschedule. He turned down drinks with a venture capital partner from New York. Then, just after 9:30, Harrison stepped into his own car, a black Tesla with glass that darkened at the push of a button, and drove himself out of Beacon Hill. He took the surface streets, not the express route, past the historic brownstones where his name appeared on development plaques, past the manicured parks where joggers wore expensive activewear and walked purebred dogs. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, only that he couldn't ignore it anymore. By 10:15, he was parked 3 blocks from his own house, engine idling, watching through tinted windows. At 10:18, the side gate opened. Joe stepped out, carrying a canvas bag he recognized, donated items from last year's charity drive that he'd never thought about again. She wore a long gray coat, slightly worn at the cuffs, and a knit scarf that looked handmade. Her shoes were simple flats, the soles thin from use. She didn't hurry, didn't look around nervously. She just walked with purpose, the stride of someone who had made this journey many times before. Harrison waited until she turned the corner, then followed. She walked 6 blocks to Charles Street and boarded the number 23 bus heading toward Roxbury. Harrison kept his distance, trailing the bus through traffic. The further they went, the more the scenery changed. The manicured sidewalks gave way to cracked pavement. The luxury condos became weathered brick walk-ups, storefronts dimmed, street noise shifted from the hum of nightlife to the drone of tired machinery and distant sirens. When Joe stepped off the bus at Dudley Square, she moved through the neighborhood like someone who belonged there, no hesitation, no confusion. She turned down a narrow side street, past a closed laundromat with bars on the windows, then slipped into a low building with chipped paint and a wooden sign barely hanging on. The sign read, in peeling letters, Roxbury Youth Haven, a place for every child, founded 2003. Harrison parked at the far end of the block and approached on foot, stopping just short of the entrance. He peered through a side window, not to spy, he told himself, but to understand. Inside, Joe was arranging food on a folding table. Plastic containers, carefully packed, clearly labeled with expiration dates. She laid out rice, beans, cooked vegetables, soup, steam lifted from the containers, fogging the air slightly around her. About 15 children, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 12, waited in quiet lines. They didn't rush, they knew her. One girl, no more than 7, with her hair in braids and a faded pink sweatshirt, asked, "Miss Joe, where's this food from?" Joe smiled, warm but worn. "From people who had more than they needed, baby. Sometimes the date on the package passes, but the food is still good. I make sure it's safe before I bring it to you. I used to be a nurse, I know what's okay and what's not." The girl nodded, no follow-up questions, just gratitude. Joe handed her a bowl and moved to the next child. Harrison stood frozen, breath caught halfway in his throat. He told himself it wasn't anger, but the feeling sat in his chest like a question he couldn't answer. She could have asked, she could have said something, but instead, she took what belonged to him, no matter how trivial it might seem, and walked it out the door like it was hers to give. It wasn't about the resources, of course. It was the fact that she chose not to tell him, that she assumed she had to work around him, not with him. That despite everything, decades of quiet, functional coexistence, she still didn't think he was the kind of man you could come to with a need. She had made a decision, and he had been left out of it. He watched her for a while longer, arms crossed, the air thick around him. Jo didn't look like someone trying to get away with something. She looked like someone doing exactly what she believed had to be done. Calm, firm, steady, the same way she had ironed his shirts, packed his suitcases, folded the corners of his sheets. Except now she was doing it for someone else. Without his permission, Harrison turned from the window and walked slowly back toward the car. The streets were still quiet, the sky hung low and gray. As he settled into the driver's seat, he didn't start the engine. He leaned back in the seat, eyes unfocused, the silence of the dashboard staring back, thinking about how strange it felt to be on the outside of something that involved your own name, your own property, your own house. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected anger to look. But he was something. He just didn't have a word for it yet. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The next afternoon, Harrison found himself in front of a building he wouldn't have looked at twice any other day. It was low, old and beige, with flaking paint and a broken intercom. There were 3 mailboxes taped shut, names written in permanent marker. The elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked months old. He had parked around the corner, walked the last block alone, and now stood at the base of narrow stairs, trying to understand what he was doing there. He knew why, but he didn't understand it yet. He climbed slowly. The stairwell smelled faintly of cleaning solution and fried onions. The hallway on the 3rd floor was dim, one overhead light flickering. He paused in front of apartment 3D, and knocked twice. No one answered right away. Just as he was about to knock again, the door opened a crack, the chain still fastened. A small boy stood there, maybe 10 years old. Thin, with big brown eyes, and a cautious curiosity. He wore a gray hoodie, too large for his frame, and mismatched socks. "You're Mr. Caldwell, right?" Harrison hesitated. "Yes, is your grandmother home?" "Not yet, she's still at the center." The boy studied him for a moment, then unhooked the chain and opened the door. "You want to come in?" Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it. "Sure." The boy disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a cup of water. "Sorry, it's warm. The fridge doesn't make it cold anymore." Harrison took it. "Thank you. You look different than the pictures." "What pictures?" The boy pointed to a small frame on the shelf beside the couch. Harrison walked over and saw it, a grainy black and white newspaper photo of himself as a child, maybe 8, standing at a ribbon-cutting ceremony next to his grandfather. Behind them, barely visible, was Jo, holding a clipboard. "My grandma says you were a good boy. Just quiet, always thinking." Harrison didn't know how to respond. He looked around the room. On the wall near the kitchen, he noticed a framed certificate. It was yellowed, the corners curling under the frame. He stepped closer and read the print. "Registered Nurse, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, issued 1984, Josephine Marie Turner, Massachusetts General Hospital." He turned toward the boy. "Your grandmother was a nurse." "She was. But she stopped when someone said they didn't want a black lady touching their baby. That was a long time ago." Harrison looked back at the certificate. He didn't say anything. The boy continued, voice matter of fact. "She tried to volunteer at clinics after that. But she said she got tired of being thanked with silence." There was something sharp in that sentence. Harrison felt it lodge in his throat. "She works a lot," the boy added, "and she never takes anything from your house, unless it's stuff people were going to throw away. Like the food from the fridge when it gets marked expired. She checks the labels. She says she'd never give us anything that could hurt someone." Harrison sat down on the armrest of the couch. He didn't trust the weight of his body on the old frame. "What's your name?" "Elijah." "Nice to meet you, Elijah." Elijah nodded politely. On the table, Harrison noticed a stack of medical documents. One was an insurance form, half-filled. Another was a medication list with dates and check marks next to them. Beside it was a bottle of generic pain reliever, half-empty, and an inhaler with a label that said refill needed. Everything in the room told a story Harrison had never asked to hear. Not because he didn't care, or maybe exactly because he didn't want to risk caring more than his position allowed. The door opened. Jo stepped in, grocery bag in hand. She paused when she saw Harrison. For a brief moment, her eyebrows rose, surprise definitely, but it faded quickly into something gentler, more curious than cautious. "Well," she said, placing the bag down, "this is unexpected." Harrison stood, unsure whether to apologize or explain. Joe looked from him to Elijah. "Did he offer you water at least?" "He did," Harrison said. "Good, I raised him right." She took off her coat, hung it neatly on a peg by the door, and turned back to him. "I was going to make something simple for dinner." "You hungry?" Harrison hesitated. "It won't poison you, Mr. Caldwell," she added with a small smile. "Just lentils and rice." He nodded once. That would be fine. Joe worked quickly in the kitchen. Elijah helped set the table with quiet confidence. Harrison watched it all like a visitor in a country he'd never studied. Joe moved differently here. Not careful, not deferential, just herself, and it was the first time he realized he had never really seen her be that person. During the meal, they talked about small things. Books Elijah liked, the weather that week, a teacher who said Elijah had potential. Nothing was said about work, about the house, or about the food that traveled between them. It was just dinner, ordinary, kind. And yet as the meal ended and Elijah carried the dishes to the sink, Harrison felt something settle in him he hadn't expected, a kind of peace laced with discomfort. Because this version of Joe, laughing with her grandson, explaining how to steam rice without wasting gas, humming softly while rinsing plates, was so far removed from the quiet presence, who folded his shirts, that he wasn't sure which one was the real her. Or worse, if he had ever really known her at all. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The streets were nearly empty, washed in the quiet yellow of early evening streetlights. Harrison kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes forward, though the road barely registered. His mind was still in that small apartment, with the uneven floor, the faded photos, the quiet boy, and the woman who had for 2 decades moved through his life like clockwork. The scent of lentils still clung to his jacket. He hadn't said much when he left. Just thank you. Joe hadn't asked why he came. She didn't press, and somehow, that unsettled him more than if she had. When he arrived home, the house greeted him in the usual way. Lights adjusted, temperature stabilized, a soft chime welcomed him back. But nothing about it felt right. Not tonight. He bypassed the living room and kitchen, and went straight to his home office. The monitors blinked awake before he touched a key. The central dashboard, pulsed with efficiency, project timelines, investment tickers, environmental controls, household logs. He ignored everything else, and pulled up the inventory system. He reopened the flagged incident reports. 5 incidents, spread over 28 days, each marked with missing or unaccounted for items from pantry or medical stock. The logs had been auto-flagged, due to discrepancies between expected and recorded quantities. He clicked through each record again, this time slowly. On first glance, it looked like Joe's name lined up exactly with the anomalies. But now, after everything he had seen and felt and tasted, he looked deeper. He opened the time-stamped warehouse scans. The kitchen staff was required to document expired or discarded food weekly. Most did, but not all. He noticed something new this time. On each flag day, there was a matching entry by the sous chef labeled menu substitution. A few lines down, an item marked for discard. Not removed, just marked, but the final deletion log was missing. He checked with the system override key, and ran an audit. Of the 10 food items marked missing, 7 had been recorded earlier that day for discard, due to nearing expiration or damage. But because the discard action wasn't completed, meaning no one scanned the item out of inventory, the system still counted them as present. The remaining 3 were marked as non-conforming stock by the catering software. Items not selected for official menu service, due to presentation or packaging defects. All flagged as waste, none recorded as removed. He stared at the screen. The cursor blinked slowly at the edge of the data grid. He moved on to the medicine cabinet log. Similar issue. A bottle of over-the-counter antiseptic had passed its usage date by 48 hours. Another bottle of allergy relief marked with a missing cap. A nutritional shake in damaged packaging. All items scheduled for replacement. None scanned out, all flagged as missing. What the system called a breach was, in fact, human omission. a small break in protocol, a task unfinished, a step skipped, and Jo, operating with her usual care and silence, had likely seen what no one else bothered to see. That those items, while technically expired, were still safe, still usable, still able to serve someone who needed them. He sat back in his chair. The room was dim, the soft glow of the monitors the only light. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes. There was no theft, no deception, no betrayal, just an invisible unspoken act of quiet correction, of salvage, of service. And he had assumed the worst. It wasn't malicious, he hadn't come at her with blame or accusations. But he had doubted her, even for a moment. And worse than that, he hadn't known her well enough to know better. He opened the personnel file, marked Turner, Josephine M. It was sparse. Start date, pay history, emergency contact, none. Performance record flawless. He clicked through to the notes section. Blank, not a single entry. 29 years of presence. No incident, no recognition, no acknowledgement. He leaned forward again and typed into the log entry box. Discrepancy resolved, no further action required. Human error, mine. He saved the note, then closed the file, closed the system, sat in the silence. He thought about the warm water Elijah had served, the mismatched socks, the way Jo had offered dinner, not with obligation, but with ease, as if welcoming him into her world was not a burden, but a matter of fact. He thought about the photograph of himself on her wall, the medical form stacked beside the couch, the certificate from a career that ended not because of performance, but because of prejudice. He had spent a lifetime building systems, streamlining processes, eliminating inefficiencies. He believed in clarity, in evidence, in control. But tonight, what unraveled him wasn't a failure of system or logic, it was a failure to see, to ask, to know, and he wondered, not for the first time that evening, how many other people had moved through his life unnoticed. Not because they were quiet, but because he had never thought to listen to the noise they didn't make. He stood finally, and walked out into the hallway. The house, efficient as ever, lit his path with soft light, but it felt colder now, not because the temperature had changed, but because something else had. He passed the kitchen, paused for a moment, then turned back and opened the pantry. Everything lined up, labeled, restocked, perfect, and meaningless. He closed the door, turned out the light, and went to bed. Not because he was tired, but because he didn't know what else to do. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he would try. 3 days passed before Harrison returned. Not because he was avoiding it, but because he wasn't sure what he was bringing with him when he came back. Words weren't enough. An apology felt insufficient, and anything more felt presumptuous. But on the third evening, just after sunset, he found himself again standing outside that narrow door marked 3D. His hand raised to knock before he could think of a reason not to. The door opened quicker than last time. Jo stood there, wearing a plain house sweater and jeans, her hands still damp from dishes. She paused when she saw him, her expression unreadable, then stepped aside without a word to let him in. Harrison took it as permission. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Elijah lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his forehead damp with a thin sheen of sweat. A humidifier hissed gently in the corner. Jo motioned for Harrison to sit in the armchair across from the couch, then disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, before returning with a cup of warm tea. She handed it to him without a word, then sat down slowly at the dining table, her eyes fixed on the boy. "How long has he been sick?" Harrison asked, his voice low. 3 days, low-grade fever, wheezing, night cough, same thing from last winter. She said it calmly, but Harrison could see the worry etched into the lines around her eyes. "Has he seen a doctor?" She met his gaze directly. "Soon." He didn't push. He looked around the room again, now more familiar than foreign. The medical forms were still stacked near the couch. The same nursing certificate hung crookedly by the bathroom door. A new bottle of prescription medication sat half full on the counter, the label nearly peeled off from condensation. "I checked everything," he said quietly. "The logs, the inventory, the flags. It was never about you. It was the system, Or rather, it was me not knowing enough to question the system sooner. Jo didn't flinch. She reached for a towel and dabbed Elijah's forehead gently, then pulled the blanket closer around his shoulders. She didn't answer. "You should have a better place than this," he added. That made her look at him again, her expression calm but clear. "I had one," she said. "A 2-bedroom, ground floor, near a decent school. That was before my daughter got sick. We sold it for the treatment. What we didn't sell went to debt. Then she died. Then Elijah got sick. Then the center lost funding, so I started bringing the kids here after hours." Her tone never turned bitter. Just plain, matter of fact. "You make more than enough to afford another home," Harrison said carefully. "My salary covers rent, food and medication," she replied. "It doesn't cover stability, Mr. Caldwell. That costs more than money these days." He leaned forward. "Then let me help." "You already have." She smiled gently. "Harris, I've never resented you for the years between us. You were a child when I came into your life, and you grew up into a man with responsibilities I can't even imagine. I watched you build your world. I never expected to be part of it. I was there to keep things steady while you moved forward. That was my role, and I accepted it with pride." She paused, looked at him fully. "I love you like a son, but I never mistook myself for your mother. I knew my place, and I never blamed you for the distance. I always hoped, though, that if life ever brought you back, you'd know the door was open." Harrison swallowed hard. "Then let me stand in it now. Not to fix the past, just to be here, as I am. That matters," she said. "It matters more than you know." Elijah stirred then, murmuring something unintelligible. Jo knelt beside him, whispered into his ear, then turned to retrieve a nebulizer from the small cabinet. She plugged it in, placed the mask over his face and turned it on. Harrison watched, something sharp twisting inside him. He had seen medical reports, end-of-quarter losses, even rescue operations for business deals gone wrong. But he had never sat still and watched someone care like this. Someone who never asked for anything in return. "Let me take him to my doctor," he said. "Tonight. He's not breathing right." Jo hesitated. "We can't afford it." "You won't have to. That's not how this works." "It is now," Harrison said firmly. They locked eyes for a long second. Then finally Jo stood. "I'll get his shoes." The hospital lobby smelled like antiseptic and fresh paint. Harrison paced while Jo sat beside Elijah in the waiting area, the boy leaning into her shoulder, eyes half closed. She stroked his hair without saying a word. The nurse called them in after 20 minutes. Harrison insisted on staying. He stood beside the doctor, answered questions, filled in gaps. He watched as Elijah was examined, scanned, stabilized. The pediatrician prescribed a new inhaler, a steroid shot and a 2-day observation. Jo signed the papers, her hands trembling slightly. Harrison stood beside her and covered every cost. Later, in the hallway outside the room, Jo approached him. Her shoulders were tense, but her voice was calm. "You did all this without asking me. I know. I told you we're not a charity case." "You're not," he said. "But I owe you more than charity. I owe you everything I forgot to see." Jo looked at him like she was trying to decide whether to accept the truth or protect herself from it. Finally she sighed. "He needs more than prescriptions. He needs hope." "So do I," Harrison said. "And I think you've given it to me, whether you meant to or not." She nodded slowly. "Then don't disappear when it gets hard." "I won't." That night, Harrison stayed at the hospital. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't respond to the 37 unread messages from board members and investors. He sat in the hallway, watching the rhythmic beep of the monitor from just inside the door, thinking of all the things he didn't know how to say, and all the ways he could start doing more than say them. At some point, Jo brought him a blanket, folded, no words, just a look. He unfolded it, pulled it over his shoulders and closed his eyes. Not because he was tired, but because for the first time in years he felt safe enough to rest. It was nearly noon when Rebecca Whitmore walked into Harrison's office without knocking. She moved with the same sharp precision she always had, heels echoing softly against the marble floor, a beige folder tucked under one arm, sunglasses perched on her head, like she had just stepped off a corporate runway. She didn't speak until the door clicked shut behind her. You missed 2 strategic planning meetings this week, she said. Harrison looked up from his screen, blinking once. I rescheduled them. Without explanation. I didn't think one was needed. Rebecca exhaled through her nose. The way she did when preparing to deal with something she found unpleasant but necessary. She stepped closer and set the folder on his desk carefully, like placing a document at a deposition. People are talking, she said. Investors, partners. Your absence is being noticed. They want to know if you're still running the company or checking out. Harrison closed his laptop. He didn't reach for the folder. I'm not checking out. Then where exactly are you? He met her eyes. At a hospital bedside, for the grandson of my housekeeper. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Housekeeper. Her name is Josephine. And she's not just a housekeeper. Rebecca folded her arms. I'm not here to question your empathy, Harrison. I'm here because we built something together. Something real. Something powerful. And you're redirecting corporate funds without board review. To investors that looks like instability, not compassion. He stood slowly, not to intimidate, but to meet her eye to eye. What do you think we built? Stability, authority, reputation, image. That too, she said without apology. And in our world, image is everything. Harrison walked around his desk and leaned against the edge, arms folded. Let me tell you what I saw this week. I saw a boy struggling to breathe while his grandmother paced through a hospital waiting room, trying to stay composed. I saw forms she couldn't afford to sign. I saw a woman who never asked for anything from anyone, holding it all together with determination and faith. And I saw a system, my system, that didn't account for her. Not because she was invisible, but because I never bothered to look. Rebecca softened slightly, but didn't back down. And how does that help the board? The foundation, your name. Harrison took a breath. It helps me become someone worth carrying that name. Silence stretched between them. A long one. She glanced toward the window, her jaw tight. Do you know how hard we worked to get this company where it is? She said. How many things we turned down. How many optics we had to maintain. And now you're throwing it all into a community center with hand-painted signs. No, he said. I'm choosing to support something that's never had signs, never had attention, never had people like us show up and just listen. Rebecca stepped closer. Is this about guilt? Because if it is, that fades. It always does. It's not guilt, he said. It's gratitude. And clarity. I'm starting to see how small I was in the world I thought I ran. Her eyes narrowed. So what now? You want to start over? Become a mentor? A hero? He shook his head. No, I just want to be decent. That feels like a good beginning. Rebecca glanced at the folder on the desk. The board has questions. If you keep making unsanctioned disbursements to external causes without a strategic framework, you risk losing voting confidence. Then let them vote. She studied him for a beat longer, then sighed. Her voice lower now. You used to call me first when things got complicated. This isn't complicated, he said. It's simple. I want the world I live in to include people like Joe and Elijah, not just people who manage them. Her mouth tightened, like she wanted to argue but didn't have the words. You used to see things in structures, she said. Now you're chasing shadows. No, he said. Now I'm chasing what's real. Rebecca reached for the folder, hesitated, then left it on the desk. I hope you know what you're doing, Harrison. He gave her a faint smile. I finally do. She walked to the door, paused, then looked over her shoulder. Don't lose everything trying to save one piece of yourself. He gave her a faint smile. Maybe I'm not trying to save a piece. Maybe I'm trying to build something new. When she was gone, the room felt heavier for a moment, then strangely lighter. He walked back to his desk, picked up the folder, and set it aside without opening it. Then he opened a blank page and began drafting a personal funding structure. One that didn't ask for permission, one that answered only to the people it served. Not because he wanted recognition, but because for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he stood for. Elijah opened his eyes quietly the next morning. The hospital room was dim, the blinds drawn halfway, a gray light slipping in from the side, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Harrison was already there, seated in the corner chair with a paperback in his lap and his phone turned over on the side table. He hadn't left during the night. He hadn't said anything when the nurses came in to check vitals at 2 and 4. He just sat there, watching the monitors and listening to the soft rise and fall of a child's breath through an oxygen mask. Elijah blinked a few times, then slowly reached up and pulled the mask away. "Did you fall asleep here?" Harrison looked up from the page he wasn't really reading. "I did." "In that chair?" Harrison nodded. "It doesn't look comfortable." "It's not as bad as it looks." Elijah smiled, small and lopsided. "You're not very good at sleeping." "Huh. Not really," Harrison admitted. "But I'm learning." The boy shifted slightly under the blanket. "Did you bring that space book again?" Harrison reached into his bag without a word and pulled out 3 books. One was about the solar system, another about astronauts, and the third had glossy pages filled with deep space telescopic images. He held them out like a magician revealing his best trick. "You pick," he said. Elijah chose the one with stars and black holes and opened it gently as if afraid it might disappear. Harrison scooted the chair closer and started reading, his voice quiet but steady. Joe appeared at the door 15 minutes later, watching them for a long moment without interrupting. Her coat was still buttoned, and a paper bag of food hung from her wrist. She said nothing at first, just set the bag on the windowsill and sat down at the far end of the room, letting the words fill the space between them all. After a while, Elijah fell asleep again, the book resting on his chest. Harrison looked over at Joe. "He's doing better," he said. She nodded. "I know the signs." Harrison stood and walked over to her, handing her the cup of coffee he'd picked up earlier. She took it without protest. For a few minutes they sat in silence, watching Elijah breathe. "He asked if I'd come next weekend," Harrison said. Joe glanced at him, then turned her eyes back to the boy. "And what did you say?" "I told him to save me a seat." She smiled, then not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that says we made it this far. "He likes you. That means something." "He sees me," Harrison said quietly. "I think that means everything." 2 days later, when Elijah was discharged, Harrison insisted on driving them home. Joe didn't argue. She sat in the back seat with her grandson, resting a hand on his shoulder as the car wound its way through the city. They didn't speak much during the ride. They didn't need to. It was the kind of quiet that comes from shared experience, not avoidance. As Harrison helped carry their things up the stairs to the apartment, Elijah looked up at him from the landing. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Harrison paused, adjusted the strap of the bag on his shoulder. "I'll be here before you finish breakfast." Elijah grinned and pushed open the door. By Saturday, Harrison found himself at the community center again. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. He just showed up, rolled up his sleeves, and started stacking folding chairs. The space was busier than usual, a handful of volunteers setting up reading stations, a few parents bringing their kids early. Joe was there already, placing a row of plastic cups beside a cooler of juice. She looked up, surprised but not startled. "You came back. I told you I would." "Yes," she said, handing him a stack of napkins. "But people say a lot of things when they're feeling needed." He didn't answer, just started arranging the cups. A girl about 6 tugged on his sleeve 10 minutes later. "Are you the guy with the books?" Harrison crouched down. "I might be. What do you like to read?" She tilted her head. "Dragons, but only nice ones. Let me see what I can do." By noon a group of kids had taken to calling him Uncle Harris, a nickname that started as a whisper and eventually turned into a chant when he agreed to lead story time. He didn't mind. In fact, he laughed, really laughed, when one of them handed him a drawing labeled Uncle Harris and the Super Readers. He kept it in his coat pocket the rest of the day. Later, as the kids filed out with their guardians, Joe stood by the door with a clipboard, checking names and offering gentle reminders about snacks and homework. Harrison leaned against the far wall watching her work. She was steady, patient, in control, but different, lighter. When the room finally emptied, she walked over to him and handed him a bottle of water. You handled the sugar rush better than I expected. I've handled boardroom buyouts, he said. That was tougher. She laughed, not a full laugh, but enough to show he wasn't entirely wrong. They stood there for a moment, both holding bottles, both looking at the chalkboard where a child had scrawled the word hope in bright pink. Thank you for staying, she said. He nodded. I didn't know how much I needed to. When he left that afternoon, Elijah walked him to the steps. They sat for a minute, knees touching, eyes on the street below. Do you think people can really change? Elijah asked, voice low. Harrison thought about it. About boardrooms and bedsides. About the weight of a child's trust. Only when someone sees them enough to believe it. Elijah looked up at him. I see you. Harrison smiled then. No layers, no walls, just a man on a step beside a boy, who had every reason not to trust anyone, and yet still did. It was a beginning, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. The following week, Harrison arrived at the community center just after noon, with no tie, no driver, and no intention of staying in the background. He had called ahead, not to announce his presence, but to ask for time to meet with the group of volunteers who managed the day-to-day programs. They gathered in the back room, folding chairs pulled into a rough circle, clipboards in hand, skepticism in the air. It wasn't hostility he felt when he walked in. It was caution, the kind that comes from too many promises broken by people who never stay long enough to help clean up. Harrison stood instead of sitting, not because he wanted to dominate, but because he wanted them to see him clearly. No filter, no angle. Thank you for making time, he began. I know you all have more pressing things to do than listen to a man in dress shoes talk about community, so I'll keep this short. I've been here a few weeks, not long enough to understand everything, but long enough to know what I didn't see before. You all are doing something rare. You're holding space for people no one else does, and I want to support that. Not by leading it, but by getting out of the way and giving you the tools to keep going. He laid out a proposal, a dedicated fund, monthly disbursements, no corporate branding, no PR press kits, just steady resources and the freedom to use them where they mattered most. No approval process through his office, no photos for social media. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard full of student rosters, raised her hand slowly. And what do you want in return? She asked. Harrison smiled. I want to stop showing up like an outsider. The room stayed quiet for a beat. Then someone else nodded, then another. Eventually the room exhaled, not with applause but with a cautious kind of agreement. Joe, who had stood quietly in the corner the whole time, walked over once the meeting ended. You realize you just gave up all the control, she said. Maybe I never needed it, Harrison replied. A few days later he asked Joe to meet him at the office of the community foundation overseeing neighborhood grants. He held the door open for her, and when she walked into the boardroom she paused. It was a simple space, round table, stack of folders, a small pitcher of water, but the weight of it was not lost on her. Why am I here? She asked, voice even. Because this is your program now, Harrison said. Not just the kitchen and the books, the budget, the direction, the voice. Joe stared at the empty seat in front of her. I've never sat at a table like this before. You've led without one for decades. Now I'm just giving it a name. She looked at him then, long and slow, as if searching his face for irony or pity. She found neither. You sure about this? Completely. She nodded once, and sat down. That was all it took. Back at the center, Elijah was walking again with more strength. His cheeks had color again, and his steps no longer wavered at every turn. He helped smaller kids with puzzles, pointed to books he'd already read, explained words with a calm confidence that felt earned, not rehearsed. One girl, maybe 5, tugged Harrison's jacket one morning. Are you Elijah's dad? She asked. Harrison chuckled, crouching next to her. No, I'm lucky to be his friend. The girl nodded, as if that made perfect sense. That weekend, the center held its first community open house under the new funding initiative. Joe had planned it with the team. A few speeches, a shared meal, a table of donated books free for the taking. No stage, no spotlights, just people, food, and stories. When she took the microphone that afternoon, the room fell still. Joe stood tall in a plain dress and soft cardigan. No makeup, no pretense. She looked at every face before her. "We didn't start this with plans or projections," she began. "We started it because kids needed a safe place to be themselves. And over time we added books, and food, and medicine, because they needed those things too. But the truth is, the only thing a community really needs to grow, to survive, to feel whole is to be seen. Sometimes, that's all it takes. Someone noticing we're here." Harrison listened from the back row, arms crossed over his chest, not to protect, but to hold steady. He felt something loosen in him with every word she spoke. Afterwards, as the chairs were folded, and the last plates cleared, Harrison stayed behind to help stack trays. Joe joined him, passing him a bag of leftover bread rolls. "They liked what you did today," she said. "It wasn't about me." She nodded. "Exactly." They stepped outside into the fading light. The street was quiet now. The kids had gone home. The noise settled, but the air still buzzed faintly with what had been created there. Joe looked toward the playground, then back at him. "You didn't change the world today." Harrison followed her gaze. "No," he said, "but I helped someone dream in it." Joe didn't smile, but her hand brushed lightly against his elbow. "That's how it begins," she said. And in that moment, beneath the sky turning from gold to gray, neither of them needed to say anything more. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between a reminder about Elijah's medication refill and a forwarded notice about a book drive. Joe nearly deleted it before opening it, assuming it was spam or some kind of mailing list she never signed up for. But the subject line stopped her cold. "Invitation to speak, Community Voices in Education Conference." She read it once, then again, then once more, slower, word by word. They were inviting her to speak at a city-run forum alongside educators, youth advocates, and non-profit directors. They wanted to hear about the reading program, about the kids, about her. She didn't respond that day, or the next. On Friday she brought it up to Harrison. They were standing outside the center after hours, watching Elijah toss a deflated soccer ball with two other kids in the parking lot. "I got a strange email," she said. Harrison looked over. "Strange good or strange bad? They want me to speak at some city conference. About education, or community. I don't know. That doesn't sound bad." Joe crossed her arms, the corners of her mouth tight. "They must think I'm someone else." Harrison didn't answer right away. He watched the kids for a minute, then turned to her fully. "If the room exists, it's yours to walk into. They don't get to decide if you belong. You do." Joe shook her head lightly. "I've never stood at a podium in my life. I speak to kids on carpet squares, and mothers in kitchens, not professionals in suits." "Then speak like that," Harrison said. "That's why they need you there." A pause. Then quietly, "You think they'll listen to someone like me?" Harrison didn't blink. "I did." That night, she clicked reply and said yes. In the week that followed, Elijah helped her practice. She sat at the kitchen table with a notebook while he read aloud what she had scribbled in pencil. He made gentle edits, crossing out words like ain't, not because they were wrong, but because he said they deserved to hear her clearly. She rewrote it twice, but still kept it hers. Plain words, real sentences. One night, he asked, "Are you nervous?" She nodded. "I've been invisible most of my life. Standing up there feels like yelling in a church." Elijah smiled, missing one front tooth. "Maybe that church needs to hear it loud." The morning of the event, Joe wore a clean cardigan and slacks. Her good shoes shined as much as they could be. She refused to let anyone write her speech. She didn't want a slideshow. She didn't want a script on a podium. She took her folded notes in her purse, and walked into the downtown Civic Hall just after 10. Harrison was already there, sitting 2 rows from the back.
He didn't wave, didn't call attention, just looked at her with the kind of quiet that told her she didn't need to prove a thing. The room held maybe 70 people, principals, librarians, funders, advocates. Most had badges, titles, or branded polos. Jo had a name tag that said Miss Josephine Turner. When they called her up, she walked calmly to the front, unfolded her paper, then didn't look at it. "Good morning," she began. "I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came because someone finally asked." She paused. A few pens stopped moving. "I don't have a degree in education. I'm not a principal or a program director. I'm a grandmother raising my grandson, and every Saturday, I sit in a folding chair and listen to kids read out loud. Not because I was trained to do that, but because they needed someone who cared enough to stay." She told them about Elijah, about the other kids, about the community center that started with nothing but a broken bookshelf and 3 donated boxes of paperbacks. She told them about kids reading by hallway light, about sharing granola bars, so no one would feel left out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use data. She just told the truth. And then for a moment, she paused and added something that wasn't in her notes. "Years ago, I helped raise a boy whose parents were taken too early. He grew up in a house too big and too quiet. I made his lunch. I folded his shirts. I walked past his trophies. He never asked about my life, and I never expected him to, but I watched him grow, and I loved him like a son, even when he didn't see me standing there." She looked directly at Harrison in the back row. "And now he sees. That tells me we can all change, if we let ourselves." At the end she folded her paper again. "You don't need a title to lead. You need presence, and you need to care." She stepped down. There was no standing ovation, no clapping frenzy, but something better happened. The room went still, like it had just witnessed something rare. When applause came, it was slow, steady, and deeply felt. Afterward people lined up. Not many, but enough. A teacher asked for advice. A non-profit lead offered to share books. A city official asked if she'd meet with their school board. Jo nodded politely, took business cards with both hands, said thank you with a small smile that never quite widened. Outside, Harrison waited by the sidewalk as the last few guests trickled out of the hall. "You didn't even look at your notes," he said, a trace of admiration in his voice. Jo gave a small shrug, calm and steady. "Didn't need them." How did it feel, standing up there? She took a breath, thoughtful, loud, but good loud, the kind that reaches places silence never could. That evening back on the porch at home, Jo sat with Elijah. The sky was fading into soft lavender, the kind of light that made everything feel softer. Elijah handed her a juice box, one of the ones they always kept cold just for him. They sat side by side without talking for a while, until he looked over and asked, "So you going to do more speeches now?" Jo laughed. "Not big, but real. Maybe, but not for the applause." "Then why?" She looked up at the sky again, then down the quiet street in front of them. Her voice was soft but sure. "Because somewhere out there there's another woman like me, sitting in the back of some school hall, thinking her voice doesn't count. Maybe if she hears someone like her speak, she'll believe she matters too. And maybe she'll stand up." Elijah leaned his head gently against her shoulder. "You made them listen today." She nodded slowly, the weight of that truth sitting gently on her chest. "No," she said, "I didn't make them listen. I reminded them we're still here."
The boardroom hadn't changed. Same glass walls, same brushed steel chairs, same filtered water and identical carafes lined neatly at the center. Harrison stood at the head of the table, palms pressed flat against the cool wood surface, eyes steady, voice calm. This wasn't a pitch, not a plea, just a man finally choosing to speak without the safety of spreadsheets. "I want to restructure a portion of our community investment portfolio," he began. "Not under marketing, not under brand strategy. I want it set aside, autonomous, with a separate advisory board and independent metrics." One of the directors leaned forward. "What would the return be?" Harrison answered without hesitation. "Lives, stability, trust." Another asked, and who exactly decides where this money goes? People on the ground, Harrison said. Educators, parents, community leaders, and Josephine Turner will be one of them. Murmurs. Someone scribbled notes. A few eyebrows raised. From the far end, Rebecca shifted in her seat, adjusted her pen on the pad, and looked at him with a long, unreadable gaze. You've diverted significant attention from the core business these past few months, one member said. Some have questioned whether your focus is sustainable. Harrison stepped away from the table slowly and gestured to the large digital screen behind him. But he didn't pull up numbers or trend lines. Instead, an image appeared. Elijah, seated on a folding chair, reading to two younger children. The word Saturday reading circle chalked behind him. We built our success by solving problems other people overlooked, Harrison said. We anticipated needs. We created value. But lately we've measured impact by margin alone. That's not enough. Not anymore. We have the chance to invest in what matters before it becomes a crisis. He paused, then added, I'm not walking away from the company. I'm walking deeper into it. Silence settled like dust. Rebecca finally spoke. And the brand, the optics, Harrison met her eyes. The brand will survive telling the truth. And the truth is, for years we benefited from a community we rarely spoke to. That stops now. She tapped her pen twice, a habit she always had when making peace with something she couldn't control. Then she nodded once. I don't agree with all of it, she said, but I've seen what it's done. Maybe that's the part I needed to see first. The vote passed 8-3. 2 weeks later, Harrison sat in his home study, not with reports or market updates but with a blank document open on his laptop. The title, A Different Legacy. It wasn't for public release, just for himself. A way to record the shift, to acknowledge the man he used to be, and the man he was trying to become. He detailed the foundation's parameters. Anonymous funding, no nameplates, no donor walls, only one instruction that recipients never be required to perform gratitude, just to continue, to build, to live. He met Joe at the center that Saturday, the papers already signed, the structure approved. She sat on the back bench under the tree, hands folded in her lap. He explained it all, the independence, the autonomy, the decision-making power. She listened, then finally said, You're not giving anything, Harrison. You're returning it to the world that raised you. He looked at her, and for a moment said nothing. Then he simply replied, Thank you. Elijah handed him a letter that afternoon, handwritten on lined paper. Uncle Harris, if I ever become a doctor, I want to open a place like you did, where no one has to show their wallet before they show their wounds. Thank you for seeing us. Love. Elijah Harrison kept that letter in his wallet, not in a safe, not on a wall. The following month, during an internal leadership summit, Joe was introduced quietly as an external advisor. No speech, no slideshow, just a name on the program and a seat at the table. Afterward, Harrison and Elijah walked through the company's atrium. They paused at a photo wall of past presidents, including Harrison's father. Elijah looked up. You think they'd be proud? Harrison thought for a second. I think they'd finally recognize me. And you, and me. As they left, an employee passing by said, Morning, Harrison. No title, no stiffness, just a name, said warmly. And Harrison nodded, holding the door open for Elijah, who stepped into the building like he belonged, because now he did. 6 months had passed since that night at the hospital. The leaves had turned, fallen, and now new buds were beginning to show on the trees lining Warren Street. Harrison arrived at Roxbury Youth Haven just after 2 on a Saturday afternoon. No tie, no polished shoes, just jeans, a sweater, and a canvas bag slung over his shoulder filled with books he'd picked up from a donation drive earlier that week. Inside, the center hummed with life. 23 kids today, more than they'd ever had before. The walls were brighter now, freshly painted by volunteers. New bookshelves lined one side of the room, labeled by reading level. A snack table offered fruit, crackers, and juice boxes. Elijah spotted him first and ran over, nearly knocking into a table. Uncle Harris, you're late. Harrison checked his watch. 2 minutes, that's late for you. He couldn't argue with that. Elijah grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a corner where 3 younger kids sat with a puzzle spread across the floor. Can you help them? They're stuck on the dinosaur section. Harrison crouched down. All right, let's see what we've got here. For the next hour, he helped with puzzles, read picture books in funny voices, and refereed a dispute over whose turn it was on the single working tablet. At one point, a girl with braids and a gap-toothed smile climbed into his lap during story time and fell asleep halfway through. Where the wild things are, he didn't move until she woke up. Joe watched from across the room, organizing the food distribution with 2 other volunteers. She caught his eye once and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. When the kids started filtering out with their parents and guardians, Harrison helped fold chairs and wipe down tables. Father Michael O'Brien, the priest who ran the center, clapped him on the shoulder. "You've become a regular fixture around here, Harrison." "Trying to be." "Well, you're doing more than trying. These kids trust you. That's not something you earn overnight." Harrison paused, a folded chair in his hands. "I don't know if I've earned it yet." Father Michael smiled. "That's how you know you have." As the sun began to set, Harrison and Joe sat on the front steps of the center. The street was quiet now. A few cars passed. A dog barked in the distance. The air smelled faintly of someone grilling nearby. Joe leaned back against the railing, arms crossed loosely. "You look different now." "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're not carrying as much." Harrison thought about that. "I think I put some of it down." "Good. You were bent over from the weight of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Do you regret anything?" Joe asked. "Yes, that I didn't do this 10 years ago." "You weren't ready then." "When did you know I was ready?" Joe smiled. "When you stopped asking permission." Another pause. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Thank you," Harrison said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Joe looked at him, her expression soft but certain. "That's what mothers do." The door behind them opened, and Elijah poked his head out. "Uncle Harris, you coming to my science fair next week?" Harrison turned. "What day?" "Thursday. At 6. I'll be there. You promise?" Harrison met the boy's eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Elijah grinned and disappeared back inside. Joe stood, brushing off her pants. "You should get home. It's getting late." Harrison stood too. "Will you be here next Saturday?" "Every Saturday," she said. "As long as they need me." "Then I'll see you next Saturday." She nodded. "I'll save you a seat." On Thursday evening, Harrison walked into the gymnasium of Elijah's school. It smelled like floor wax and poster paint. Rows of tables were set up, each displaying a student project. Parents and teachers milled about, clipboards in hand, examining volcanoes and solar system models. He found Elijah's table near the back. The display board read, "The Science of Breathing, How Inhalers Save Lives." Elijah stood beside it, wearing a button-up shirt that was slightly too big and a tie that Joe had clearly helped him with. His face lit up when he saw Harrison. "You came." "Of course I came." Elijah gestured to his board. "Want to hear my presentation?" "Absolutely." For the next 10 minutes Elijah explained, with remarkable clarity, how asthma affects the lungs, how inhalers work, and why access to medication is a matter of life and death. He spoke with confidence, gesturing to diagrams he'd drawn himself. When he finished, Harrison didn't say anything right away. He just looked at this boy, this brilliant, resilient, hopeful boy, and felt something swell in his chest. "That was incredible, Elijah. You think I'll win?" "I think you already have." Elijah didn't win first place. He got an honorable mention. But when they handed him the certificate, he looked into the crowd, found Harrison, and held it up with both hands. Harrison clapped louder than anyone else in the room. That night, back at his townhouse, Harrison sat in his office. But he wasn't working. He was looking at a photo on his phone, a picture he'd taken at the science fair. Elijah holding his certificate, Joe standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling. He set the phone down and opened his laptop. He typed a single sentence into a new document. "The best investment I ever made was paying attention." He saved it, closed the laptop, and for the first time in years went to bed without checking his email. The final scene came on a quiet Sunday morning. 3 weeks later, Harrison arrived at Joe's apartment with a box of pastries from a bakery in Beacon Hill and 2 cups of coffee. When she opened the door, she raised an eyebrow. "You know you don't have to bring gifts every time you visit." "I know, but I wanted to." She let him in. Elijah was at the table working on homework. He looked up, saw the pastries and grinned.
Are those the ones with the chocolate? They are. Yes. They sat together at the small table, eating pastries and talking about nothing important. School, the weather, a new book Elijah wanted to read. It was ordinary, simple, perfect. Before he left, Joe walked him to the door. "You've changed, you know," she said. "I hope so. No, I mean it. You're not the same person who stood in my kitchen 6 months ago looking lost." Harrison smiled. "I was lost. I just didn't know it yet. And now I know where I am." Joe nodded slowly. "Good, because we need you here. I need to be here." She reached out and squeezed his hand once, brief but firm. Then she let go. "See you Saturday. See you Saturday." As Harrison walked down the stairs and out onto Warren Street, he paused for a moment. The neighborhood was waking up, people heading to church, kids playing on stoops, the smell of breakfast cooking drifting from open windows. He looked back at the building. At the window on the 3rd floor where Joe and Elijah lived, where a different kind of wealth existed, one he was only beginning to understand, and he realized something. He had come here thinking he might help, but they had given him something far more valuable, a place where he could simply belong. He got in his car, started the engine and drove home, not to his empty townhouse in Beacon Hill, but to the place he was beginning to think of as home, wherever Joe and Elijah were, wherever people saw him, really saw him, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. 1 year later, the Roxbury Youth Haven had expanded into the building next door. The walls were painted bright colors now, blue, yellow, green. There were 2 full-time staff members, 15 regular volunteers, and over 60 kids who came through the doors every week. Joe ran the programs with quiet authority. Harrison sat on the advisory board, but mostly just showed up on Saturdays to read books and help with homework. Elijah, now 11, had started a peer tutoring program. He taught science to younger kids and talked about medical school like it was a certainty, not a dream. On the anniversary of the center's expansion, they held a small celebration. No press, no politicians, just the people who made it work. At the end of the night, as everyone was leaving, Harrison found himself alone in the main room. He looked around at the walls covered in children's art, the shelves full of books, the tables where so many meals had been shared. Joe appeared beside him, 2 paper cups of juice in her hands. She offered him one, thinking deep thoughts, just remembering. Remembering what? "The night I followed you here, how angry I was, how wrong I was." Joe sipped her juice. "You weren't wrong to care, you were just caring about the wrong things. And now," she gestured around the room, "now you care about the right things." They stood in silence for a moment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed you that night?" Harrison asked. Joe smiled. "I don't wonder, I know. You'd still be sitting in that big house, alone thinking you had everything. And I'd still be here, doing this work, invisible to people like you. I don't want to be people like me anymore." "You're not. That's the whole point." Harrison set down his cup. "I owe you everything, Joe." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. But if you want to thank me, just keep showing up. That's all any of us can do. Show up, see people, stay. I can do that. I know you can. You already are." They walked to the door together. Outside the street was dark, lit only by flickering streetlights and the warm glow from apartment windows. It wasn't Beacon Hill, it wasn't polished or perfect, but it was real, and it was home. Joe locked the door behind them. "See you next week." Harrison smiled. "I'll be here," and he was.